Clara was waiting for me when I got home, seated at the kitchen table with a carefully blank expression on her face. The kids were already in bed, and the house was still and quiet, too quiet. I knew something was coming, something she'd been building up to. There'd been clues for weeks now. The late nights, the silences, the strange, overly casual comments about needing more space and me time. I had chalked it up to stress, to midlife questions, or maybe even burnout. But tonight, there was something more. I could see it in her posture, the way her hands were clasped too tightly in front of her, her fingers pressing into her knuckles until they turned white. She looked at me, her gaze steady and, somehow, detached. "I need to talk to you," she began, voice calm, even sympathetic. "All right," I replied, trying to stay neutral, but I could feel my heart thumping faster. I sat down across from her, trying to meet her gaze, but something in her expression was already making me feel like an outsider. "I love you," she started, "but I need to explore for myself. I feel like I've lost sight of who I am. And this isn't about you. It's about me, about my happiness, my fulfillment." Her words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. This wasn't a conversation I'd ever expected, especially not with her. I wanted to interrupt, to ask questions, to stop this train before it hurtled completely off the tracks, but I couldn't find the words. So, I just listened. Clara continued, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. "I want us to stay together, but I need some freedom, to see other people." She exhaled, a faint, relieved smile flitting across her lips as if she had just shed a heavy burden. My brain was struggling to process what she was saying. This was Clara, the woman I had loved, the mother of our 2 kids, the partner I had thought I'd known inside and out. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. I wanted to shake her, to scream, to wake up from whatever nightmare I had suddenly stumbled into. But I just sat there, stunned, as she kept talking. "I'll still be here for you, for the kids," she said, her voice softening as if she could somehow make this more palatable. "It's not that I don't want this life. I just want a chance to see what else is out there. You're my husband, and I love you, but I need to figure this out on my own terms." I was still silent, unable to summon a single coherent response. It felt like she was asking me to sit by while she opened a door I never wanted her to open, to simply accept that she was going to go on some kind of journey, one that had no place for me. Every word she said seemed to build an invisible wall between us, a wall that she was perfectly content with, as if she had already planned everything out. "Are you saying you want an open marriage?" I finally managed, my voice hoarse and barely a whisper. The words felt foreign, wrong, as if speaking them would make this conversation real. She nodded slowly, her face a mixture of relief and hesitation. "I guess that's what you'd call it. Just a chance to see what I need, to understand myself better. And it doesn't have to change us, not if we don't let it." I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth, how easily she made it sound. As if she could compartmentalize our life together, separate it from whatever she was seeking elsewhere. I felt something snap inside me, a flicker of anger buried beneath the hurt and confusion. Did she really think it was that simple? Did she think I could just sit here and wait, pretend that this was normal? "And what about us?" I asked, my voice finally finding strength. "What about the life we've built, the family we have? Are you willing to risk all of that just for some experiment?" Clara's eyes flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a hint of regret. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "I'm not throwing anything away," she said firmly. "I still want us, I still want this life. I just need more." She placed her hand over mine, her gaze steady and imploring. "Please, can't you understand that? I need to do this." Her hand felt cold, her touch unfamiliar. I pulled my hand away, not out of anger, but because I couldn't stand the thought of her touch now, not after what she had just asked of me. "No," I replied, my voice low but steady. "I don't understand. I don't understand how you can ask me to stand by and watch while you go out and do whatever it is you feel you need to do. I thought we were a team, that we were in this together." Her face softened, but I could see she had made up her mind. I'm not asking you to watch. I'm asking you to trust me. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to fight, to argue, to make her see how insane this was, how much it was hurting me. But I could see from her face, from the calm, resolved expression she wore, that I would never reach her. This was a decision she had already made, one she felt justified in. I need some air, I said, standing abruptly. I couldn't sit there another second. I needed space to breathe, to think, to process what was happening. She didn't stop me, didn't call out as I walked to the door and slipped out into the cool night air. I walked around our quiet neighborhood, my mind churning with everything she'd said. I thought about the life we'd built, the trust we'd shared, the countless moments that I had thought bound us together. I thought about our kids, who slept peacefully upstairs, oblivious to the bomb their mother had just dropped on our lives. By the time I returned, the house was dark. Clara was already asleep, or at least pretending to be. I lay down beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with the shock and betrayal, the hurt and anger. Somewhere deep inside, a part of me wanted to make it work, to somehow accommodate her needs, her journey. But I knew, even then, that I couldn't just sit by and watch. I couldn't simply be a passive player in my own life. The next day, I started piecing things together. Her late nights, her weekend retreats, all the things I had brushed off as normal, as innocent, suddenly took on new meaning. I waited until she left for work, her bag slung over her shoulder as if nothing had changed. As soon as she was gone, I went to her computer, my hands trembling as I typed in the password she had used for years. Emails. Messages. Reservations. All of it was right there, neatly organized, shamelessly open. There was even a message from her so-called friend, a man named Mark, with whom she was already planning her journey. I felt a wave of nausea, but I forced myself to keep reading, to see just how far she was willing to go. By the time I was done, I felt hollow, like a part of me had been ripped out. The woman I had loved, the woman I had shared my life with, was already gone. She had left before she'd even spoken to me. And in her place was a stranger, someone who felt entitled to her secrets, to my acceptance, to a life that no longer included me. That night, I kept my distance. I went through the motions of family dinner, asked the kids about their days, and answered Clara's small talk with quiet nods and non-committal responses. She didn't notice my silence, she was too wrapped up in her own excitement, her own plans. It was then that I realized I couldn't sit idly by while she tore apart the life we had built together. If she wanted a fresh start, then I'd make sure she got it. But it wouldn't be on her terms, it would be on mine. I began making my own plans, fueled by a quiet, simmering resolve. If Clara thought she could upend my life and walk away unscathed, she was in for a surprise. In the days that followed, I started preparing. I spoke with a lawyer, transferred half our savings into a separate account, and quietly documented every night she spent finding herself. She thought she was moving on, that she could have it all without consequences. But I was ready. The following days felt like a hazy, surreal routine, but beneath the surface, I was sharply aware of everything Clara did, every small movement and word that she thought I wasn't noticing. She moved about our home as if nothing had changed, slipping back into our normal rhythms as though the conversation we'd had that night was just another bit of small talk. I watched her from across the kitchen as she made breakfast for the kids, sipping her coffee with a smile that no longer seemed to reach her eyes. She had grown skilled at hiding the truth, so skilled that I almost believed it myself. But the proof was right there. Every time she was out of the house, I'd return to her computer, where I combed through emails, saved notes, and messages. Mark's name came up frequently, each new message more personal, more pointedly intimate. He knew about me. He knew that Clara was working on something at home, as she'd put it, softening the truth as if I were just a small hurdle in her path to fulfillment. I couldn't bring myself to read all of the details, but I couldn't turn away from it either. I wanted to know just how far she was willing to go. One day after she left, I found myself sitting at her computer, staring at an email she'd sent to Mark with the subject line, Friday night. The email was a short list of plans she had: dinner, maybe a stroll around the park, see where things lead. My hands tightened on the edge of the desk, and for a moment, I wanted to shut the laptop and walk away. But then I realized how foolish I'd been. She hadn't been waiting to see if I'd come around or even if I'd react. She had already started seeing him, planning nights away, living her other life right under my nose. The lawyer's words echoed in my head as I had recounted the situation, half in a daze, earlier that week. "This isn't just about infidelity," she'd said. "It's about what you want next. Do you want to fight for the marriage, or are you ready to protect yourself and move on?" I hadn't answered her then. I had still been holding on to some fragment of hope, thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could convince Clara to come back, to see what she was risking. But that was gone now. Seeing her emails, her perfectly detailed plans to spend the night with someone else, I felt that hope drain away. The life we'd built was no longer what she wanted. She had made her choice. All that remained was for me to make mine. That Friday, I played my role, just as I'd been doing all week. I went to work, picked up the kids, made dinner, and went through the motions of a perfectly normal evening while Clara took her time in front of the mirror, slipping on a dress I hadn't seen in years. She said she was meeting friends from her yoga class, throwing out just enough of the truth to make her lie sound convincing. I nodded, my face a blank mask as she waved goodbye and slipped out the door. I waited for half an hour before pulling on my coat and heading out myself, tracking her location from a program I'd installed on her phone the night after our conversation. I had given her one last chance to change her mind, to see what she was doing, and she had thrown it aside. She was already at the restaurant she'd mentioned in her emails to Mark, a small place on the edge of town with dim lights and secluded tables. I parked a little down the street, just far enough to be out of sight, but close enough that I could see the silhouettes of the people inside. Through the windows, I saw her, seated across from a man who had his hand on hers, his fingers grazing her wrist as they laughed. It was like watching a different person, someone I didn't know. She was radiant, her smile wide and genuine, the kind of expression she hadn't worn at home in ages. I felt an almost physical ache, a pang that reminded me of the life we'd once shared, the love that had filled our days before whatever this was had crept into her heart. I wanted to barge in, to confront her, to let her see that I wasn't as blind as she thought. But I stopped myself. My lawyer's words played over in my mind. "You need proof, not just for you but for everything else that comes after." She had advised patience, quiet observation, and the careful collection of evidence. Tonight, as much as I wanted to act, I realized that I had to hold back. Confronting her now would only lead to denial, arguments, and further lies. I wasn't going to give her the chance to squirm out of this or twist the story to fit her own narrative. I sat in the car, hands clenched on the steering wheel, watching them through the window until the image became a blur. And then I drove away, back to the house that now felt hollow and unfamiliar. Over the next few days, Clara continued her routine, her facade unwavering. Each night, she returned to our bed, curled up beside me like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't look at her the same way. Every touch, every casual brush of her hand, felt like a betrayal. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but I knew it would only lead to more of her rehearsed speeches, more of her empty justifications about freedom and self-discovery. Instead, I went through her phone. I found the texts, the pictures, the plans she and Mark had made. I documented everything, copying files, saving screenshots, making sure that every word, every lie, was there, ready for the moment I'd need it. In the midst of it all, I began to think about what life would look like without her. The silence at night, the emptiness that would replace the familiar sounds of our shared life. I thought about the kids, about how they would feel, what they would need. I was their anchor, their stability, and I couldn't let my own turmoil disrupt their lives. I owed them a steady hand, a calm presence, and I resolved to keep things stable, at least until I had everything in order. Clara seemed oblivious to the distance growing between us. She was wrapped up in her plans, her new life, and I could see the anticipation in her eyes every time she checked her phone or lingered over her makeup in the mirror. She was slipping further away, and for once, I was okay with that. One night, as she prepared for yet another yoga class dinner, she turned to me with an almost casual smile. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft and sweet, as if she were genuinely concerned. I forced a smile. "Of course," I replied, my voice even. "Just busy with work, that's all." She seemed satisfied, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek before heading out the door. I watched her leave, my resolve hardening with every step she took. She had no idea what was coming, no idea of the truth I was quietly assembling, piece by piece. In the end, it would be her choice, her decision to stray, to abandon the life we'd built. But it would be my decision to end it, to protect what I could and rebuild without her. For now, I just had to wait, to be patient, and to be ready for the moment when I'd finally close this chapter. As I sat in the quiet of our home that night, I felt the weight of her absence, the empty space where our love had once lived. But there was something else, too, something new and unexpected. It was the faintest glimmer of freedom, a sense of strength rising up from the ashes of everything she had broken. I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story of our life together. I was going to write my own ending. The days blurred into one another as I kept gathering evidence, tucking away every last shred of Clara's duplicity. Each time she left the house, I went through the steps, checking her messages, reading her emails, and skimming her social media, which was now peppered with vague affirmations about new adventures and rediscovering herself. It was almost laughable. She was broadcasting her transformation, selling this fantasy to her online world, while everyone else saw it as just another woman experiencing midlife clarity. But I knew better. The lawyer, a patient woman with a calm demeanor, had been a steady anchor through all of this. She was seasoned, unflappable, and clear-eyed, exactly what I needed. I went over every detail with her in our sessions, laying out everything I'd learned, every bit of evidence I'd collected. Her steady responses helped to ground me. I wanted to ask her how often she saw men like me in her office, blindsided by infidelity, but I couldn't bring myself to ask. Part of me didn't want to know how common my pain was. As the days passed, Clara's behavior grew bolder. She was almost brazen about her plans with Mark, leaving the house dressed to the nines, her phone practically glued to her hand, texting and laughing at whatever messages he sent. She thought I was oblivious, so I kept my distance, playing the role of the distracted husband, always wrapped up in work or the kids. I watched her closely, though, careful to maintain a mask of indifference, and she never suspected a thing. But inside, every time she left, every time I watched her walk out that door, my resolve deepened. One Friday evening, after I'd tucked the kids into bed, I noticed that Clara had left her phone on the kitchen counter. She was upstairs, singing quietly to herself as she prepared for another yoga retreat. I picked up the phone, already unlocked, and skimmed through her recent texts. She and Mark were planning a weekend getaway, somewhere secluded, just the two of them. She'd already reserved a cabin in the mountains, set up dinner reservations, and made a list of things she wanted to bring. I could feel my hands tremble, but I steadied myself. This was it. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. This was the proof, the final piece. I set the phone down just as she came back downstairs. She was wrapped in a light coat, her hair perfectly done, makeup immaculate. She looked happy. She looked like a woman in love. The thought twisted my stomach, but I stayed calm. She gave me a brief smile as she picked up her phone and checked her reflection one last time in the hallway mirror. "Heading out?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She turned, a faint flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Yeah, just meeting up with some friends," she said casually, avoiding my gaze as she adjusted her coat. I nodded. "Have a good time." Clara's smile tightened, and for a brief second, I wondered if she sensed something in my tone. But she brushed it off, gave a quick wave, and slipped out the door, leaving me alone in the quiet of our empty house. I didn't follow her this time. I didn't need to. I had all I required. That weekend, I spent hours gathering every piece of evidence I had, compiling it neatly, organizing every screenshot, every message, every damning detail. The more I worked, the more I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching someone else's life unravel. But I was past the point of anger. This was just necessary. Sunday evening came, and Clara returned, looking flushed and carefree. She greeted the kids with hugs, acting as if she'd been on a perfectly innocent girls' trip. But when she saw me, her smile faltered ever so slightly. I kept my expression blank, meeting her gaze for a heartbeat too long, and I saw something flash in her eyes, something close to guilt, or maybe it was fear. She quickly looked away. We didn't talk that night. She went to bed early, claiming she was tired, and I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, going over everything one last time in my head. The evidence was airtight. The lawyer had confirmed that everything was in place. All I had to do now was to execute the plan. The next morning, I was up early, getting the kids ready for school before Clara even stirred. As she finally came downstairs, looking tired and a little disheveled, I handed her a cup of coffee and sat across from her at the kitchen table. She looked at me, surprised, but took the coffee with a grateful smile. "I've been doing some thinking," I said, my voice calm, almost casual. She looked up at me, frowning slightly. "About what?" "About us. About this new life you seem so eager to explore." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I think it's time we both had some space to figure out what we want." A flicker of something passed over her face, surprise, confusion, maybe even a hint of alarm. "What do you mean?" I leaned back, meeting her gaze steadily. "You've made it clear you want more than what we have." "I get that now. And I think you're right. We both deserve the chance to find what makes us happy." Her lips parted as she looked at me, as if she were trying to understand, but her confusion was genuine. She had expected something else, a confrontation, perhaps, maybe even anger. But not this. "So, what are you saying?" I shrugged. "I think it's best if we take a step back. Maybe some time apart. A separation." She went silent, her eyes widening as she took in my words. She looked like she was struggling to form a response, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her expression. "But what about the kids?" "We'll work it out," I replied, my voice steady. "We'll do what's best for them, always. But for now, I think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a while." There it was. The shock, the dawning realization that I wasn't playing her game, that I wasn't going to stand by while she continued her fantasy life. She looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I didn't mean for things to get this far," she whispered. "Maybe not," I replied, though I couldn't tell if I believed her. "But they did. And now we have to deal with it." For the first time, she looked truly vulnerable. Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, a faint look of resignation settling over her face. She didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. She just sat there, staring at her coffee, her eyes distant and hollow. And in that moment, I felt a pang of pity, a faint echo of the love we'd once shared. But it was too late for pity. Too late for love. That afternoon, Clara packed a small suitcase, her face pale and drawn as she gathered her things. I helped her quietly, making sure she took what she needed, and when the time came for her to leave, I stood in the doorway with the kids, watching as she drove away. They didn't understand, and I didn't try to explain it to them. Not yet. Once Clara was gone, I went back inside, closing the door behind me. The house felt empty, quieter than it had ever been. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the space where Clara had been sitting just that morning, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It was done. The life I'd known was over, and in its place, there was only the quiet of a new beginning. The days that followed were filled with calls to lawyers, meetings, and quiet talks with the kids, explaining as best I could that things were going to be different. I didn't tell them everything. They didn't need to know the full story, at least not now. All they needed was my presence, my steady hand guiding them through the confusion and change. But when Clara tried to come back, a week later, with tears and apologies and promises to make things right, I was ready. The paperwork was already filed. A week passed, then two, and Clara stayed away, respecting the boundaries I had drawn. I kept busy with the kids, focusing on work, and even started reconnecting with old friends, trying to piece together what my life would look like on the other side of this. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of stability, a sense of purpose in rebuilding the parts of my life that mattered most. It was easier than I thought, this life without her. The kids were adjusting well enough, and each day seemed to bring a little more light into the house. For the first time in years, I felt I was carving out a new, honest path forward. Then, one evening, I got a message from Clara. It was short and formal, a request to meet somewhere neutral, a coffee shop across town. She wanted to talk, and, surprisingly, the tone of her message seemed to lack the urgency and desperation I'd expected. I agreed to meet, but I told her I had no intention of changing my mind. I was firm in my decision, and I wouldn't be drawn back into her web of excuses and manipulations. But curiosity nagged at me. There was a finality in her words, as if she had something significant to say, something she needed me to hear. When I arrived at the coffee shop, she was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. She looked different, as though the weight of everything had finally settled in, her face pale and drawn, her eyes weary. She motioned for me to sit, and I took a seat across from her, watching her carefully, wondering what this was all about. "Thank you for coming," she began quietly, her hands wrapped around the cup like it was the only thing grounding her. I nodded, waiting for her to continue, not offering her any reassurance. I had come here for answers, not for closure. I didn't owe her that. She took a breath, staring down into her cup as if trying to find the right words. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally. "For everything. For hurting you. For lying. For everything I put you through." I stayed silent, letting her speak. I had nothing to say, her words couldn't erase what she'd done. She looked up, meeting my gaze, and I saw something in her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I thought I wanted freedom. I thought that exploring something new would bring me happiness, that it would fill whatever emptiness I was feeling inside. Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. But it didn't. It just made me realize what I'd thrown away. I clenched my jaw, biting back the words I wanted to say, the bitterness that had lingered since the day I discovered the truth. But I held my silence. She had more to say, and I wanted to hear it all. "Mark left," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. He never wanted anything serious. Once I was out of the house, once it became real, he just disappeared. He told me it was all just a fling for him, a distraction. She swallowed, blinking back tears. I left my family, my life, for nothing. A part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to see her suffer the consequences of her choices. But as I looked at her, broken and hollow, I felt only pity. The woman who had once been my wife, the woman I had built my life around, was now a stranger, shattered by her own mistakes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin stack of papers, pushing them across the table toward me. "These are the divorce papers," she said softly. I signed them. I glanced down, surprised, then looked back up at her. You're agreeing to this?" She nodded, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "I lost the right to fight, to ask for anything else from you. I know that. I hurt you in ways I can't take back. And I want you to be free, too." I nodded slowly, picking up the papers, feeling the weight of them in my hands. This was it, then. The end of everything we'd built, sealed with her signature. But just as I was about to stand, to leave and put this all behind me, she reached out, her hand brushing mine. "Wait," she said, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. I looked back at her, and she hesitated, as if weighing her words. "There's something else I need to tell you." I felt a flicker of apprehension, a sense that there was still one last piece of this story that hadn't been revealed. What is it? Clara took a shaky breath, her fingers trembling as she met my gaze. I didn't realize it until a few weeks ago, but I'm pregnant. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment, I couldn't process what she had just said. Pregnant? The word echoed in my mind, hollow and surreal. I looked at her, my voice barely a whisper. Is it? She nodded, her eyes filled with unshed tears. It's Mark's. I felt a rush of emotions, shock, anger, disbelief, and something else, something hollow and painful, as I tried to comprehend what this meant. I couldn't even look at her, my mind reeling as I tried to wrap my head around this new, terrible truth. I don't expect anything from you, she said, her voice breaking. I thought you should know. I wanted to be honest with you, for once. I stared at her, feeling the weight of everything crashing down around me. This was the final blow, the final piece of the betrayal that had shattered our life together. She was carrying another man's child, a child conceived in the midst of her lies, her selfishness. It felt like a cruel twist of fate, a bitter irony that I couldn't escape. For a moment, I thought of everything I could say, everything I wanted to say, but none of it mattered. I realized then that this wasn't my burden to carry. This was hers, and hers alone. I stood slowly, looking down at her one last time, my voice calm and steady. Goodbye, Clara. Her face crumpled as she whispered, I'm so sorry. I turned, walking out of the coffee shop, the weight of the past weeks falling away with each step. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see, nothing left to hold on to. Clara's life, her choices, her consequences, they were hers now, and I was free.